Please interpret that back into English for me, Congresswoman, specifically the portion you chose to speak entirely in Somali. Senator John Kennedy casually slid a lone piece of paper over the wide desk, prompting the most frequently cited female lawmaker in the Capitol to gaze at the translation of her own speech as her face drained to a pale, ashen hue. Merely 90 seconds earlier, she had openly labeled him a clueless elderly man on a live broadcast transmitted across 3 major television networks. The whole chamber had delighted in her biting insult. But now, that very room had plunged into a quietness so heavy you could detect the faint buzzing of the climate control system. Ilhan Omar picked up the document. Her hand was clearly shaking, and every lens positioned inside Dirksen 562 caught that unmistakable quiver. She opened her mouth to utter 3 basic words she had earlier stated in a dialect she presumed nobody in the U.S. government would grasp. Yet, nothing came out. Right across the desk, the supposedly clueless elderly man merely bided his time. His spectacles were already neatly tucked into his hand. He remained there, as stoic as a locked gate, displaying absolutely zero urgency. He had asked an inquiry so basic a youngster could handle it. Just speak your own statement out loud. Still, the representative who famously had a sharp retort for every scenario, who had a track record of arguing her way out of any tight spot, sat immobilized, gripping the sole paper she declined to read aloud. "There's no rush, ma'am," Kennedy suggested, his tone as soft as a creaking porch door. "I'm perfectly willing to recite it for you if your vision is bothering you. I certainly know my own eyes get tired, given my advanced age." A wave of chuckles sparked in the rear seats, beginning as a quiet rumble, the typical way a crowd reacts, before fully allowing itself to embrace the sarcasm. To completely grasp how a lawmaker who built her entire brand on fearless, outspoken claims abruptly lost command of a chamber over 3 unsaid words, you have to go back roughly 40 minutes to the instance she first sauntered into that room. Upon her arrival, she was wholly confident she had already won. If you've ever felt talked down to by a DC insider who concluded they were naturally better than your whole community without ever stepping foot in it, do me a quick solid and smash that like button immediately. You're about to see precisely what happens when that kind of individual misjudges the wrong elderly gentleman. Let us rewind. The committee room was packed far more tightly than the formal itinerary implied it would be. Whispers had spread that Kennedy had deliberately demanded her attendance by name, and 3 leading networks had positioned their broadcast gear against the back wall, their little red recording indicators glowing. Ilhan Omar swaggered in with her usual flair, handling the venue like a triviality she had already mastered. She dropped her binder onto the table. She showed no trace of nerves because she had decided, somewhere near the doorway, that nobody present was important enough to make her anxious. When the panel leader formally gave her permission to speak, she claimed the moment with the presence of an individual handing down the ultimate ruling in an endless dispute. "Before we kick off this dramatic charade," she commenced, "let me express what everyone else is too courteous to say. I've looked into who set up this inquiry, and I need to be completely honest with the people tuning in from their houses about what I am currently subjected to. Today, I'm facing questioning from a clueless older gentleman who actually thinks the edges of the universe stop at the borders of Louisiana. This is a person who has probably never read an international policy summary in his whole existence, who constantly confuses a lingering Southern accent with deep intellect, and who operates under the fantasy that talking at a snail's pace means you are objectively right." A quiet ripple washed over the crowd, not quite a shocked breath, but something undeniably frostier. "And I would direct that same thought to many of the males watching this program from their couches," she went on, a subtle, condescending smirk resting on her face. "Namely, the ones who use Middle America as a replacement for having character. I am the face of tomorrow. He is just a relic belonging in a glass case. So, let's stop pretending this is a conversation between peers." She leaned backward into her seat, projecting pride, totally sure her verbal blow had struck flawlessly. It certainly had hit something, though not the mark she had aimed for. She had successfully branded every older gentleman tuning in from a breakfast bar in Mississippi or Minnesota as an ancient antique on live TV, completely on purpose, and she truly thought she had secured a massive win. If just hearing your hometown treated like a running gag and your life's work dismissed as outdated makes your blood boil, drop 1 word into the comments below right now. Type the word, museum. Let her witness your presence, and then stay tuned, because this old gentleman is about to finally speak up. John Kennedy didn't even wince at the personal jab. He rarely ever did. He sat still, his hands clasped together, his glasses perched low on the slope of his nose. He let her finish her entire rant. He let the ovation she so desperately awaited completely fall flat, and he let the resulting, stifling quiet drag on for just a fraction too long, right until the crowd started to wonder if he had even processed her mockery. Only at that moment did he lean into his mic. His initial gesture was to offer his thanks. "Congresswoman," he articulated evenly, "I want to express my gratitude for that. That was truly enlightening. I picked up a massive amount in those 90 seconds about exactly how you view the ordinary people who cover your salary." He let the word enlightening dangle in the atmosphere for a beat, analyzing it the way a person might study a curious rock picked up from a gravel path. "Now, I am just a basic rural attorney. I went to a few respectable colleges, but my real legal education happened in a Louisiana courtroom where the AC is perpetually busted, and the judge in charge has been familiar with your relatives since you were in diapers. In a setting like that, you rapidly figure out that there are basically only two types of inquiries: the ones a person can address straight on, and the ones a person burns a massive amount of fancy words trying hard to dodge. I'm only going to pose the first type to you today. Very simple topics. The sort of details a slow, aging man from Zachary can effortlessly follow. I'll do my very best to maintain a speed that suits you." "I'd value that," Omar responded bluntly. "Ma'am, I surely will." He didn't immediately grab any of his organized papers. That was the signature of Kennedy's approach, a method well known to anyone who had tuned into his sessions. He never went straight for the throat while you were actively preparing for the hit. He started the dialogue with mundane details, basic questions. He courteously questioned the length of her time on the panel, nodding thoughtfully at her replies, as if he were hearing a local resident describe their vegetable patch. He asked if she found her legislative duties rewarding. He inquired, almost shyly, if she viewed herself as careful with her public remarks, similar to how a lawyer might act, or if she favored speaking spontaneously from the heart, letting her words land wherever they might. "I express exactly what I'm thinking," Omar proclaimed confidently. "I decline to focus group my own morality the way the men in this building endlessly do. If that honesty turns me into a lightning rod, so be it. I'd much rather be hated for being genuine than loved for a lie." "That is a stellar answer. I sincerely mean that." Kennedy nodded at a leisurely pace, looking like a restaurant customer who had just received his ideal meal and wanted to appreciate the presentation before eating. "My dad always instructed me, a man's real value is only as strong as the truth of his word. It seems you hold his worldview, and given he never got past the 8th grade, that is one quality you and an elderly man's father clearly have in common." A mild ripple of laughter drifted across his half of the chamber. "Moreover, you speak multiple languages fluidly, with written Somali among them?" "I do, quite fluently," she affirmed. "Well, good for you. I can barely handle the English vocabulary, and on some mornings I even wrestle with that." Another laugh surfaced, noticeably friendlier this time. "So, let's cement this on the public record, sharply and unmistakably, so nobody can argue later on that you were unfairly tricked into a corner. You constantly mean what you say, and you say precisely what you mean. Whether it's spoken in English, in Somali, or in Pig Latin, it makes absolutely zero difference. You are the identical Ilhan Omar in every single setting, employing every single dialect. That is the real individual presently sitting opposite me, steady, unwavering. That is exactly all I needed." He tightened his clasped fingers slightly, and the snare quietly locked into its initial vital position. "Keep a tight hold on that belief, Congresswoman. Cling to it firmly. I have a heavy feeling we're going to need it very soon." Right behind her seat, a junior aide looked down at an illuminated phone display, froze entirely for a split second, and hurriedly flipped the gadget face down against the hard desk. Nobody in the wider audience caught it. Not just yet. Kennedy reached down and grabbed a single sheet of paper, imitating the effortless gesture of picking up a shopping receipt from a dining table. There was absolutely no drama involved. "You made a comment at a community event a few years back," he pointed out. "Out in public, standing on a platform, talking to a very welcoming crowd. I'm going to recite it word for word, because I never want you claiming later that I twisted your words." He pulled his spectacles down by a fraction. "You were speaking about your own demographic and the severe hardships it has faced. Then, you shifted to outlining a very distinct Tuesday morning in September And you classified the people who committed that act, the males who brutally steered passenger planes into those buildings. Your precise statement was, some people did something. He laid the paper flat against the desk, ironing out the texture with his first two fingers. Some people, he echoed steadily, did something. He gazed at her past the top edges of his glasses. I have mentally unpacked that exact phrase on endless restless nights, ma'am. 3,000 blameless lives. Mothers who packed school lunches that dawn and never came back to eat them. Firefighters who rushed up the steps while every other living soul in that building was desperately running down, purely because climbing into the blaze was their job. A guy who held a total stranger's hand in a soot-filled stairwell, just to make sure she wouldn't die alone. And yet, the phrasing you opted for in front of an active mic, possessing the entire English dictionary to choose from, was, some people did something. As if an unknown motorist scuffed your fender in a supermarket lot. As if it were just an unlucky change in the forecast. He allowed the weight of his statement to blanket the chamber. I am not going to stand in front of this panel and tell you what was living in your soul when you spoke those syllables, because I don't have the power to see inside it, and neither do these broadcast lenses. But I do have the power to read, ma'am, despite my old age. I have the power to listen. And so does every single silver-haired man you proudly waved away as a glass case relic just 40 minutes past. And what we all collectively heard was the absolutely weakest possible phrasing used to frame the absolutely most massive possible tragedy. The room had shifted into that intensely specific, oppressive quiet where every person desperately wants an outcome but is equally terrified of what it might entail. Right then, in the third tier of the spectator seating, a gentleman stood up. He was from a previous generation, clothed casually in a simple jacket, sporting a small, plasticized tag hanging from a string around his collar, the exact kind of badge given to mourning relatives at Ground Zero events. He rose with the rigid stance of a fellow whose bones needed intense mental coaching to hold up his mass. A security guard instantly moved toward him, but the committee head slightly elevated a palm, indicating to let the gentleman stay. The mourning dad did not yell. He stared squarely at Ilhan Omar, and when he spoke, his pitch was surprisingly stable, though ground completely down to the spiritual nerve. My little girl was not merely some people, he proclaimed, and she most definitely did not merely do something. She picked up her office line on the 90th-something level. She frantically informed her mom that she adored her, and then the line went completely dead. My loved ones have been stuck inside that severed line for many painful years now. I used to be a classroom educator. I managed a kids' recreational baseball squad. I am not a glass case relic either, ma'am. I am just a dad who traveled a massive distance to be in the exact same space as the lawmaker, who minimized the most devastating dawn of my life into a flippant idiom. He hesitated, his wrinkled hand leaning heavily against the top of the empty seat ahead of him for balance. So, you're going to have to excuse me, Congresswoman, he finished. But I drove a massive way praying to hear you call her something. He did not sit back down. He stayed upright right there in the third row for the remainder of the ongoing event. Every single time the broadcast lenses focused closely on Omar's expression, they also caught him standing resolutely over her shoulder, as enduring and unshakable as a marble monument. An old gentleman who completely rejected being ignored. If the picture of that dad rising to his feet just placed a knot in your throat, leave one solitary word in the comments section. Just type anything to signal the algorithm that folks out there recognized his voice, too. Then stick around, because this is the precise instant she pivots to the attack, and she hits back unbelievably fiercely. Omar's jaw tightened firmly. She was intimately acquainted with this exact combat zone. She knew the landscape, and she performed the exact tactic she reliably used whenever the narrative foundation crumbled below her. She tried to fundamentally change the basis of the clash. I comprehend exactly what this spectacle represents, she fired back, her voice rising as she accessed her dependable well of outrage. Fury was an emotional space where she constantly felt protected. This hearing isn't about one particular phrase. It has never, not for a single second, been about a phrase. This is essentially about a female Muslim, a displaced migrant, a minority woman holding a position of influence inside a system that was historically never built to accept people who resemble me. It is about me speaking facts that make conventional males like you writhe in annoyance. You don't have the right to preach to me. What you are doing carries a clear name. That name is Islamophobia. That name is xenophobia. And every single intellectually genuine person viewing this program sees it flawlessly. And you must give her credit for a brief second. Her strategy actually succeeded. The vibe in the chamber tangibly pivoted in her direction. Journalists' pens started scratching wildly. A nearby aide nodded with fierce endorsement. A lady sitting near the front, who had been giggling at Kennedy's quips a moment ago, abruptly looked uncomfortably down at her lap, the amusement freezing in her airway. The momentum belonged completely to her. You could literally sense the trained reaction waving through the room like an unexpected gust of chilly air. It was the deeply conditioned American flinch, the deeply rooted cultural urge to physically retreat from those volatile trigger words, rather than directly dealing with the actual issue hidden beneath them. Her defense tactic held the chamber captive for roughly 20 seconds. It could have lasted even longer, but Kennedy completely refused to back away. He refused to take on a gentler pitch, and he absolutely refused to enact the surrender that those exact phrases are designed to force out of a public servant. "Ma'am," he answered, his voice staying surprisingly soft, "I plan to walk very cautiously right now, because you've thrown a deeply grave charge, and a charge of that scale deserves a fully serious reply. I am not, in any way, doubting your spiritual beliefs. I would never commit such an act. I have honorably worked next to decent men of your exact religion inside this very legislative chamber, and every single one of them would happily swear that I have never once weaponized their faith against them." He flattened the paper out on the table. "The folks who held intense grievances with your phrase, 'Some people did something,' ma'am, they weren't solely aging white males from the borders of Louisiana. They were surviving spouses of emergency responders. They were mourning black moms living in Queens. They were dedicated followers of your very own spiritual path who physically drew back when they processed your words. You simply cannot brush all of those varied mourning people under the carpet of a single handy buzzword and assume they will magically disappear. That particular word is much too heavy for you to swing like a broom." The trained flinch entirely vanished from the chamber. What washed in to take its place was vastly more ruinous to her stance. It was authorization. Behind her seat, the junior aide who had earlier glanced at her mobile device leaned in perilously close to Omar's ear, muttering something swift and pressing. Omar delivered a brisk, rejecting shake of her head, shooing the assistant away without ever breaking her stare with Kennedy. Whatever detail was being presented, she intensely refused to process it right now. The broadcast cameras clearly caught the desperate muttering. They couldn't make out the specific words, but the whole crowd felt the abrupt jump in tension, similar to how a group can subconsciously sense a device buzzing intensely in another person's pocket. The painful mystery hovered, completely unresolved. What exactly had that junior assistant just viewed on her screen? Kennedy let the tension linger in the atmosphere. He was an expert at allowing awkward instances to steep. He took an excruciatingly slow drink from his tumbler and set it back down with a crisp, intentional clink. For 3 painful seconds, that small impact of glass against timber was the most deafening noise in the whole committee space. "I'd be practically done with my inquiries right now," he declared. "I want you to hear me validate that when a person says one incorrect thing, even a deeply hurtful thing, we accept that we are all imperfect wrongdoers, and we mostly just keep moving down the path. But this isn't a standalone event with you, Congresswoman. It is a meticulously planned routine. And I strongly think that the citizens who pay for your lifestyle have secured the right to watch somebody count the beats of that routine out loud, just this single time." He dug into a thin beige folder and pulled out another batch of documents, fastened by a metal clip. He raised them up so the whole crowd could confirm that there were, indeed, 2 distinct sheets placed next to each other. "A few years ago," he resumed, "you made a public statement about a certain political advocacy group, and the main point of your remark, based on how a huge chunk of the masses read it, was that our country's foreign backing for a vital international partner basically came down to financial corruption, to cold, raw money, and the resulting outrage poured down on you intensely. But here is the vital piece of information I want the people tuning in from their couches to note very closely. That political fire did not start from my right-leaning side of the room. It started from your own political wing, your own House Speaker, your own faction's bosses." He laid the initial piece of paper flat against the table. "As a result, you put out an official public remark. And inside the wording of that document, ma'am, you somehow managed to perform 2 conflicting deeds at the exact same time, a feat I honestly did not think a person was able to execute." He pushed his spectacles a bit lower on his nose again. "You published a mea culpa," he noted. "And yet, in the very same sigh, Printed on the very same piece of paper, you stubbornly announced that you backed every single syllable you initially uttered. He placed the second piece of paper directly adjacent to the first, carefully matching up the borders with his fingers, resembling an investigator putting two separate photos next to each other to analyze culprit details. You asserted you were attentively hearing and growing from the public, and instantly trailed that by announcing you repented for absolutely nothing, all wrapped up inside one media release. I studied it 4 distinct times in my car this morning, Congresswoman, and for the absolute life of me, I could not spot the genuine apology hidden inside your supposed apology. It is an incredibly stunning display of verbal acrobatics. I couldn't duplicate it if I posed in front of a glass and rehearsed for a whole month. An outburst of chuckles broke from the viewing section, swift and completely spontaneous. A man sitting in the second tier frantically shielded his lips but failed to muffle the noise. Even the morning dad in the casual jacket, who had stood like a guard, allowed himself the slightest tightening of his jaw. It wasn't quite a complete grin, but it certainly belonged to the same emotional category. "That is not a sincere apology, ma'am," Kennedy continued, his pitch lowering to a near murmur. "That is a linguistic ransom situation. You parade out the phrase sorry purely so the news lenses can record that you spoke it, and then you immediately pull it back so your extremist supporters know you never truly meant it. And based on my own observation, you have pulled that exact trick every single time you wind up in hot water for years straight. You utter the provocative phrase. You measure the mood of the space. And when the masses inevitably rebel, you get back up and tell us that we just misheard your words. You look the exact folks repeating your precise words back to you straight in the eye and tell them that they are the individuals with the hearing deficit. You allege it is a massive misrepresentation of a heavily nuanced stance on a complicated international issue that we are just too stupid to understand. It's a formal release with your custom signature pressed onto the base of it. Congresswoman, Kennedy pushed forward. I didn't write it. You did. 2 times over, as far as I can translate. The remorseful variant and the unrepentant variant living together on the same sheet. This round, the chuckling in the chamber erupted much larger. It wasn't the ultimate, crushing laugh, yet the variety that permanently ends a public career, but it was a genuine one. The kind of chuckling that fuels its own energy, where the audience starts giggling partly at the ridiculousness of the scenario, and partly at one another for breaking etiquette. Omar's hands automatically clenched the border of the thick timber table. She had vast experience sensing the atmosphere of a space turn hostile against her. She recognized the exact emotional climate of this particular room, and she was sharply aware that the ground was quickly disappearing from under her. But Kennedy was already in the midst of tossing those sheets aside and grabbing his last piece of proof. Feeling the pivot, the crowd instantly quieted down without needing any cue. "But all of that is in the distant past," he stated casually. "I only brought up those prior events so you can't stare into the lens and persuade the people at home that today is just about one bad selection of phrases from a long while ago. Because here is the freshest update, and this, to be honest, is the main reason I called you all the way over to this hearing room." He pulled out a thick, bound stack of papers, featuring a secondary bundle of documents fastened securely to the rear. The whole room instinctively leaned in, exhibiting the bodily stance of a crowd preparing for an unavoidable crash. "This specific occurrence is quite fresh," he declared, "and I actually had to order an expert translation for it, which, if I'm being completely truthful, took a decent amount of work, because you elected not to give this talk in English." He firmly fixed his spectacles on his face. "Back in your district in Minneapolis, standing inside a lodging banquet hall, you claimed the podium in front of a stuffed room of U.S. citizens, your exact voting demographic, the people who put you in this role. And you totally stopped talking in the English language. You switched completely over to Somali, a tongue that the overwhelming bulk of that particular room, and essentially the whole of this American Republic, absolutely does not understand. And communicating in that external dialect, ma'am, speaking to that particular crowd, you swore a solemn oath." He slowly lifted his gaze over the tops of his glasses. "You directly vowed to them that the United States national government would carry out whatever regulations you all required it to carry out. You promised them that as long as you held a spot in this American Congress, no external power was going to intrude upon Somalia's oceanic borders. You stood solidly on U.S. ground, speaking to U.S. electors, and you directly informed them whose hands were actually guiding the vehicle." He firmly knocked his pointer finger against the printed copy. "Now, you have openly griped that the supplied interpretation is wrong and biased. Maybe it is. I view myself as a very logical fellow, so I am going to offer a remarkably just deal. The authentic page is resting right ahead of you. I urge you to read it aloud to this panel in English. Your original concepts, your own vocalization, presented to the citizens who pay for that exact seat you are so incredibly proud of occupying. He set the paper down on the desk, pointing the words directly at her, and pushed it exactly 1 inch nearer. Because here is my core problem, Congresswoman. A person who boldly boasts she says precisely what she intends, in absolutely any dialect, just as you fiercely promised me a mere 20 minutes prior that exact person should be perfectly equipped to recite her own address out loud in front of her own governmental bosses without even flinching. He sat back into his upholstered chair. So go right on ahead, please. Inform this chamber precisely what you informed that chamber. She glared fiercely at the sheet of paper. She made absolutely zero effort to grab it. A high-profile lawmaker who had promised that one independent nation's administration would answer directly to another nation's people, using a dialect intentionally selected so the home country's citizens couldn't police the vow. If your gut just twisted a tiny bit hearing that, this is the precise network you need to be glued to. Smash subscribe this very moment, because the series of events that happens next is the exact instance she will spend the rest of her public existence regretting the news cameras hadn't magically broken down. She didn't extend her hand to grab the paper. Instead, she rigidified her frame, pulled her mic fiercely toward her mouth, and fired back with absolutely everything she still had in her armory. And to be just to her, it was an intimidating reprisal. She did not quietly slip away into the shadows. You want to start a conversation about national allegiance? She spat, her tone hushed, swift, and beaming with rage. All right, let's unpack it. I showed up in this country owning absolutely zero, nothing whatsoever. I came out of a filthy displacement camp with the actual dust of exile still covering my shoes. I was a little kid who was made to watch her home country brutally rip itself to pieces. Still, I learned your complicated tongue, every single structural rule of it, vastly better than half the locally born males who currently occupy this structure. I proactively achieved my U.S. citizenship standing in a legal hall, with my right palm lifted to the heavens, and I meant every single vowel of the pledge I made. I proactively won this legislative position inside a region that has chosen me repeatedly, over and over, via open and legitimate democratic races that you are totally invited to go check yourself. I have individually written laws that literally puts meals into the bellies of hungry U.S. kids, while you squander the Senate's hours giving folksy rants about fishing for catfish, cooking crawfish, and stroking your hound. And you, Senator, she scoffed. You merely received your position by birth. You were tossed the keys to a thriving nation the minute you drew breath, and you were basically handed an American Senate spot immediately after. Still, you have the absolute nerve, the shocking audacity, to sit there in your pricey tailored clothing and question if I truly deserve my spot. I completely refuse to be educated on the idea of patriotic allegiance by an elite fellow who has never, for a single second in his whole life, been made to demonstrate that he actually fit in anywhere. So, no. I will absolutely not perform like a trained animal for your media lenses. I am a chosen Congresswoman of the United States of America. I have bled to achieve this role. And I will never say sorry for the scale of the inquiries I bring to the chamber, nor will I say sorry for the exact dialects I opt to deliver them in. And for a brief moment, it was an awe-inspiring display. Honestly, it was verbally commanding. A clear chunk of the room's vibe shifted back to her side. A handful of journalists briefly paused their writing. The emotional tide of the room shuddered and leveled out. For about 3 or 4 painful seconds, someone could almost imagine she was going to effectively steer her way out of that snare and leave on her own terms. Kennedy allowed her to finish the whole speech. He let the enormous gravity of her words entirely hit home. And then, he performed the move that forever took off the symbolic fighting gloves. The innocent rural attorney facade disappeared immediately. The homey, grandfather-like appeal peeled off him like a thick, cold-weather jacket falling off an iron peg. What stayed underneath was dangerously even, perfectly balanced, and completely icy. Absolutely no one in this chamber is preaching to you about your personal background, Congresswoman, he declared in a tone so frighteningly hushed, the whole crowd had to actually lean in simply to catch it. You showed up here with zero, and you built a remarkable existence. I would happily shake your hand in praise of that success in any supermarket lot in the nation. And I mean that honesty right down to the bottoms of my footwear. But that is not what is presently being judged here. He firmly pressed a single index finger straight onto the interpreted copy. What is presently under scrutiny is extremely clear. You use the English tongue when talking to us. You use the Somali tongue when talking to them. And inside those two completely distinct rooms, you give two completely clashing messages, and you heavily count on the premise that neither room will ever find out what was spoken in the other. He kept his stance. He did not bat an eye. You stood in front of a mass of the exact citizens who dispatched you to D.C., and you intentionally shifted to a language they couldn't possibly understand, specifically so you could pledge to an overseas demographic the one explicit promise you would never dare utter to your U.S. constituents' faces in standard English. That is not a display of governmental courage, ma'am. That is the complete opposite of courage. Real courage is staring folks in the pupil and handing over the harsh reality to the people who actually hold the authority to make you answer for it. You aren't proactively devoted to two distinct countries, ma'am. You are merely devoted to whatever room you currently find yourself standing inside. Absolutely zero people chuckled at that remark. It dropped like a boulder, resting into a vastly lower, grimmer segment of the crowd's shared awareness, the zone where permanent verdicts are hammered out, the sort of epiphany that an audience doesn't merely brush off or alter its opinion on afterward. Senator, with all appropriate deference, Omar initiated. We are located a massive distance beyond the notion of deference, Congresswoman, Kennedy cut in, not necessarily with spite, but with total conclusiveness. Deference was here 40 minutes prior. Deference was around right before you got up and openly announced that every single silver-haired male in the nation currently viewing this program was a filthy antique, that his cherished hometown was a sad punchline, and that his whole life's wisdom was a pointless gag. I've been tracking your storyline perfectly well. As it happens, the clueless old gentleman is perfectly able to keep pace after all. The panel leader loudly cleared his throat, cutting through the thick quiet. He then went on to perform the singular specific move for which she had absolutely zero countermeasure. He didn't elevate his pitch at her. He didn't throw charges. He didn't suddenly demand a formal panel tally. He merely asked, using the intensely dull, flat pitch of typical bureaucratic process, totally stripped of any passionate fire, whether the gentlewoman from Minnesota would offer the panel the simple politeness of dictating the emphasized portion of her own public speech into the formal Congressional log in English, purely to make sure it was recorded right. He specifically phrased it as being carried out in fairness to her own declared complaints about the interpretation's correctness. In fairness to her, that was easily the most destructive part of the appeal, and it wasn't even meant to be cruel. It was simply standard administrative protocol, and the paper was resting right there, a few inches from her palms. She grabbed it. Her hold was visibly trembling, and every high-resolution lens nearby recorded that it was trembling. She glared down at the typed words, her own uttered concepts. The English version rested in a tidily arranged, attached interpretation right behind the initial Somali copy. The two separate pages were hooked together by a single, small, dark metal clip. To dictate the words out loud was to formally confirm Kennedy's charge. To explicitly decline to dictate it was to confirm the charge even more loudly. There was no magical third choice open to her. There never is in these situations. She managed to push out the initial three terms. The United States and then her own hearing finally registered what her lips were performing, and she suddenly stopped. She set the paper back onto the table, and then she performed a small, supposedly minor bodily movement that the whole country saw, and that she would never, ever be able to take back. She began anxiously pulling the dark metal clip off the edge of the documents with her thumbnail. It is the precise, unconscious fidgeting individuals do when their palms urgently need a physical chore because their mind has totally run out of tactical alternatives. The iron clasp abruptly snapped free. The two pieces of paper bodily disconnected from each other. The English interpretation and the Somali source. The governmental vow she had loudly promoted, and the hidden guarantee she had meant for no one else to catch. The two sheets glided roughly an inch away from each other on the glossy timber desk and simply sat there, completely detached from one another, right ahead of the blinking lenses and the observing nation. The iron fastener made a small, piercing click against the timber as it aggressively popped loose. In a space that was totally devoid of sound, the noise traveled unbelievably far. It bounced across the total silence of the room like a magistrate's mallet that no one had purposefully meant to swing. She didn't extend her arm to gather the detached pages. She made zero attempt to put the bundle back together. She merely rested her hands safely in her lap, hovering right above the two split pieces of her conflicting storyline. And she spoke absolutely nothing. That specific noise, the pop of a lone, inexpensive metal fastener springing open in a chamber so painfully silent you could hear a tack hit the rug, that is the exact acoustic hallmark of a governmental trajectory permanently shifting its course on live national TV. If reading about that tight confrontation just sent full-body shivers through you, ensure you switch your channel alerts on right now, because what happened after the news cameras finally shut off is the vital aftermath that popular media completely ignores. Stick around with me here. The panel leader formally asked, for the ultimate time, if the gentlewoman wanted to provide any extra reply for the log. She signaled she did not want to reply. By the time the session officially ended, that small video fragment had already gained a viral nickname, and the label was unbelievably harmful to her reputation. An unnamed creator had perfectly cut the vital 40-second interaction, the document gliding over the table, the insistence to read it back in English. The three strained terms succeeded by total silence, the iron pop of the metal clasp snapping free, the two sheets visually floating away from each other. They dropped the footage onto the web, and by the middle of the afternoon, you practically couldn't scroll for 10 moments on any mobile device in the country without the clip auto-playing. And here was the vital piece that ought to have terrified her the most, presuming she was still able to process anything beyond the extreme embarrassment glowing on her face. Absolutely no one online was arguing over the global complexities of her address. They weren't fighting about the autonomy of Somalia, or the nuances of Somaliland, or interpretation correctness, or global boundaries, or any of the huge, elevated subjects she had intensely wished that morning's storyline to center on. There was basically no meaningful discussion left to occur. Millions of people were simply observing a high-profile lawmaker being handed a printed copy of her own statements and totally refusing to speak them out loud, running on a constant, unavoidable cycle. That night, the main national broadcast programs started their shows with a paused, motionless picture. Omar seated with her palms, firmly clasped in her lap, the two translated sheets sitting noticeably separate ahead of her, looking like a balance scale that had finally leaned unchangeably toward one side. One specific channel aired the picture with a bottom-screen graphic that held nothing except Senator Kennedy's crushing statement displayed in harsh white font against a dark background. Loyal to whichever room you're standing in. They didn't even bother tossing in any expert analysis or remarks because absolutely zero was needed. Out in the wide stone hallways positioned right outside the committee room, an independent reporter caught a Democratic House member, a guy who had dependably voted in sync with Omar on countless legal pushes over the previous several years. The lawmaker intensely insisted his name stay off the record, and he anxiously looked down the corridor in both directions before finally opening his mouth. Then, he leaned close and gave his evaluation, his tone hushed and swift. We proactively ran defense and offered political shielding for her for a very extended period, he admitted. Years, frankly. You offer that sort of allegiance for people in your own political group, but you totally cannot offer political shielding in a chamber that has permanently ceased being frightened by her speeches. There is no damage control media release on Earth that can silence that particular bell. He quickly hurried off before the journalist could even lift his audio device. By the next morning, Omar's formal media team basically showed the unnamed lawmaker to be perfectly right by publishing a thick, 4-paragraph printed release. Absolutely no one took the time to read beyond the first line, mostly because the trending video fragment had completely canceled out the release before it was even written. You simply cannot issue a paper explaining a scenario when the whole country just physically observed you decline to defend it out loud. There is no second page accessible when your defense is total silent. That exact night, the morning dad sporting the casual jacket traveled the incredibly massive stretch back to his residence. He never once reached over to switch on his auto stereo. He simply didn't require the background noise. He had effectively obtained exactly what he had journeyed to D.C. to secure. Somewhere close to the state line, completely solo in the gloom, with only his high beams piercing the vacant pavement, he softly muttered his departed girl's name out loud exactly once. He did this most evenings. And then, he traveled the rest of the way in a deep quiet. A quiet that, for the absolute first time in more than 20 years, finally seemed as if it had been legitimately deserved. At the same time, resting in a simple dining area down in Mississippi, An aging guy with gray hair and a cup of black brew that had gone chilly a while ago, viewed the trending video fragment one last time on a mobile device his adolescent granddaughter had earlier set up for him. He was totally not a glass case relic. He was a guy who had built an honorable existence utilizing his own two hands. He just shook his head with a sluggish, intentional movement, shut down the bright display, and rested silently in the unlit cooking area. He was joined by the tiny, unadulterated contentment known only to a guy who had been directly told he was much too elderly and clueless to understand the contemporary age, courtesy of a lawmaker who ultimately showed herself unable to recite her own published statements out loud. Regarding John Kennedy, he performed the precise same ritual he constantly performed, which basically added up to nothing dramatic whatsoever. He peacefully collected the two split sheets of paper from the thick timber table, carefully matching up the English interpretation with the Somali source one last time. He tidily folded the papers straight down the middle line. He effortlessly slipped the bent papers into the inner chest pocket of his custom jacket, and he peacefully strolled away. He walked straight past the blinking lenses. He strolled past the messy crowd of journalists forcefully yelling his name down the stone hallway. And he strolled straight past the currently vacant upholstered seat where the most aggressively cited female in the U.S. Capitol had ultimately, fully, run out of words to speak. As it happens, the clueless old gentleman was perfectly equipped to understand the atmosphere, and the whole reality slipped neatly into one single chest pocket.